Hey, group leaders, this is Chris coming to you with this week's group overview for the week of November 11th, and we will be heading into 2 Kings chapters 11 through 13 as we continue our study through the book of 2 Kings. This week, the lesson is essentially going to be divided, as has been the last several weeks, into two different parts. The first part will look at the biblical text, and the second part will look at the church in America and how several issues are confronting Christians. I want to just tell you up front, this week is a tough lesson. And for those of you that maybe don't want to get into some of the controversial things, I think there's enough in the first part of the lesson on the text itself that you can cover that as we look at 2 Kings 11 through 13. For those that would like to enter into some of the territory of difficult conversation, we will be looking at the issue of transgenderism. And so we'll get back into that as we look at the second part of this lesson. But first, I want to kind of walk you through the first part of the lesson as we look at the biblical text. To help speed things up this week, and again, this lesson has been a tough one to write, and I've spent a lot of time, I'm just going to walk you through the notes themselves and let you see some of the things that I'm thinking about as we walk through the questions. The first part, as I mentioned, is dealing with the text itself, and we'll give you a summary right up front here as you look at these chapters that will kind of give you the overview of what's going on in these chapters. And the focus that we're going to bring to the text really has to do with the person of Joash, king of Judah. And it starts out in this section with really a kind of a dark story about Joash's grandmother, a wicked queen named Athaliah, who is a descendant or a granddaughter of Omri and a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And as the family of Ahab is wiped out by Jehu, Queen Athaliah sees the opportunity to take the throne for herself of Judah. And so she does that. Her son has been killed by Jehu. And so in order to capture the throne, she goes about clearing out, and in other words, killing the remaining sons of Ahaziah. And this is the line of David through Ahaziah, the kings of Judah. And essentially, what we find in this week's text is that all of the sons of Ahaziah, except for one infant child named Joash, are killed by their grandmother, this wicked queen. And so that gives you some of the overtone for this, and we'll spend some time looking into what the messianic significance of Joash. And as we just mentioned, this is the line of David, and it is hanging by a thread at this point. And so we look at this situation and we realize that throughout the Old Testament, Satan has been trying to wipe out the line of David, starting clear back before he even knew that David would be the line of the Messiah. We see this kind of brought out in the very early phases of Genesis in chapter 3, when God, speaking to Satan, who is masquerading as a serpent at that point, tells Satan that the seed of the woman will stomp on his head or crush his head. And there's that hint of a virgin birth. And so from that point forward, we see the focus narrowed down to the family of Abraham, and then through Abraham's son Isaac and Jacob. And then, of course, Jacob has the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of those sons, Judah, becomes the tribe of Judah. And it's from this tribe that David is born. And of course, we know from our study in 2 Samuel, looking at 2 Samuel chapter 7, that this is when God revealed his eternal covenant with David, that it would be one of his sons who would sit on his throne forever. And so from that point on, we know it is through the line of David that the Messiah will come. And we see many examples throughout the Old Testament where Satan is trying to wipe out this line. And this is just a very good example of that. And it comes down to this one child, Jehoash, who is the last remaining heir of the line of David. And so there's some good information here that you can use to study that and see how God uses the faith of one woman, Jehoshaphat, to save this king, and from that, of course, comes the continued line of David that ultimately ends up with the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. As we transition to the second part of the lesson this week, we're going to be looking at the tough issue of transgenderism, and this is something that, as a church, we need to be able to talk about with our people, and our people need to be able to talk about this with their own children. It's something that's impacting our culture. It's a new topic. It's something that really didn't even hit the horizon until 2016. And so we are in the very early phases of this. And the first part of the lesson, I kind of underscore some of the things we've been talking about from the beginning of this study, just helping us to understand the cycles of history and where we may be right now in America as we see the cycles of history. And I really believe that 2016, when we look back at this time, decades from now, we're going to see that 2016 is the start of another great reset, or a paradigm shift in which the world will be very, very different in 2030 than it was in 2016. And things are just very rapidly changing. And so one of the areas that we've seen a lot of traction in the last several years, and by several I mean 3 years, is in the area of degrading sexual norms. So again, if you go back to 2008, when President Obama ran for office, he ran so as one who stood on traditional marriage. He was against same-sex marriage, and yet it was during his term that we saw the battle for same-sex marriage essentially lost, or for same-sex marriage won, and the battle for traditional marriage lost when the Supreme Court handed down its decision that legalized same-sex marriage. That triggered almost immediately the next phase of the war, which has been over transgender issues. And so this is a topic that we need to be able to talk about. So the first part of the lesson here, I give you some understanding of what transgenderism is about and some of the terminologies that use to help describe it. Keep in note that these things are changing rapidly, and some of the words that were appropriate, for example, transgender, that was appropriate 2 years ago, really are being identified now as gender identity. So we no longer see people who are just transgender. We see people who are in various phases of gender identity, and that could be any number of things. It's no longer a binary choice between just a male and female. It's a whole spectrum of choices that people can identify with. And so even in the last couple years, the definitions are changing. One of the areas that I think we need to acknowledge, and it's tough because a lot of us don't even want to acknowledge that this is true, but the government has really focused its intentions on an area where it can have great impact and where it can see the greatest long-term impact, and that is with our public schools. And so we give you some information here, again, going back to 2016, not long ago, a letter that was sent to school administrators from the Obama administration. It's called, as you can see here, a Dear Colleague letter, in which they essentially told the schools that in order to continue receiving federal funds through Title IX, they need to toe the line when it comes to how they handle transgender students and how they respond to transgender students. And so this is something that we need to acknowledge, that the public schools really are the place where the government has focused its attention and is seeking to have the greatest impact in shaping how the next generation views this important issue. I gave you just a real brief piece of information here about Ankeny schools, and again, this is something that I would use as a point of information, but it's certainly not meant to hammer down on Ankeny schools. It's just one example of the community where we live right here. And I've given you a link to a presentation by one of the administrative people at Ankeny Community Schools and how they have progressed over the last few years concerning the gender issue. And I've given you in the notes here a summary chart that was actually published in 2015 that shows the schools kind of summary of their plan and how they're going to do this. And, it's one of those things where as a parent and as a community person within Ankeny, we need to be aware that this is where the schools are going. This is not something that is hidden. In fact, I would say that if you read their information, they're pretty proud of their position on gender equality and the plan that they have laid out, which they see as a progressive plan, a plan that is leading other schools in how to address the gender issues. This is just one example, and I think if you want to dig deeper into this, follow some of the links that are in the notes and do a little searching on your own. And I think you'll find that most public schools in Iowa have a similar plan in place and are following a similar agenda. So this brings us to some of the maybe the talking points that we can use to help people as they seek to have conversations not only with their children but with neighbors, friends, and coworkers about the issue of transgenderism. I use the argument, and again, I'm basing this off of our study of the book, The Church in Babylon by Erwin Lutzer, and I follow his argument here, and I agree with this, that transgenderism is a mental problem. Understand that is not an accepted understanding today about transgenderism. In fact, if you were to state that publicly in a setting that where you found yourself in a hostile environment, that you would probably cause you to be linked with hate speech and accused of being a bigot. But I want to stress that I believe this is a mental health issue, that it's something that was recognized by our mental health professionals for decades, and it's only been in the last few years that these issues have been pushed out of the mental health realm and really tried to bring them into a normalized environment. And so we go from the perspective that this is a mental health issue, and there's some things that we can talk about there as a church that will help us to understand this from a better perspective. And then I give you some examples of how the church can respond when it is accused of bigotry or hate speech. And again, if this is a conversation that we wade into, and I believe it's one that we will need to wade into, this is a challenge we have to be ready to be charged with, and something that we need to face. How do we respond to the person that says you're just a bigot, or that you are that what you're saying is hate speech? And so we talk through some of those things in the notes, and I think it will provide enough information to give your people some things to begin to grab hold of. To kind of bring this all home, back to the theme of is there no hope, what is the antidote for hate speech? As a Christian, I think, again, we can very quickly point to the gospel. And I think one of the things that Christians have to learn how to do is to love people and to respect people, but not condone their sin. And that's where we often feel like we are painted into a box. We're often charged with the reality that Jesus was a friend of sinners and tax collectors. And we're reminded of the great commandment, love our neighbor, right? That's the part that is always quoted, love our neighbor as ourselves. But they forget the rest of that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two depend all the law and the prophets. And so as we interact with people, we need to be in a position where we can do so in a loving way and yet not condone their sin. Again, we are looking to engage the culture in conversation, not affirm their values and their morals, and not run from them. And so we need to be able to engage with them in a loving manner. And I think that is something that is going to take practice on our part as we engage with people. We do not want to come across as self-righteous or as some kind of hateful person who is condemning people unilaterally for their beliefs, but recognizing that apart from the gospel, this should not be unusual for people to believe this way, because Satan is the ruler of this world. And so our role is to point them to the gospel. And so that brings us to the last little section here, and there's some help for parents. This may generate a lot of questions, and so we've linked to some resources that you can point people to that will help them have these conversations with their children and begin to understand some of the things that the school system is teaching your children. That's a really tough thing to acknowledge for a lot of us as parents, that our kids, even as young as 5th and 6th graders, are more fluent in this topic than we are, that they're more comfortable talking about it than we are, because this is what they are talking about in school. And so, again, folks, this is a tough lesson, but I think you'll find that this will really resonate with a lot of our people. And this is something that a lot of parents, if they haven't run into already, they're going to run into it. And it's something that we need to be prepared for as a church to talk about in a loving way, but in an informed way. And so make sure you read the material. Make sure that you pray over your group as you go into this. And again, make sure you lead with a lot of grace and understanding as we deal with some difficult issues that are confronting us in this day and age. So that's a look at this week's lesson. And again, any feedback you have, I would greatly appreciate. I love you guys, and I'll be praying for you this coming week as we deal with this topic. And just remember that our place is to point people to Jesus Christ. He is the reason for our hope. And the question we're asking this week is there any hope? The answer is yes, and it's found in Jesus Christ. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.